Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this will be the final video of this React 2021 course. Again, this is meant just to introduce you to React, but at this point you'll have learned all the pieces you need to start assembling and building whatever apps you want to build. Okay, it's just a matter of taking all these pieces we've discussed and building the things that you imagine. Always start off with the product in mind. Don't think so much about the React code. Think about what you want to build and the steps in that user experience, and then think about, okay, how do I construct that experience with the tools that I'm aware of that I have? Okay, and think about what we've learned in each of these videos and how can I construct that specific experience. But what inevitably happens in any app is that you start having a lot of state, okay, because you have a lot of things that need to change all the time. And sometimes that state needs to be used in multiple components, so you end up in this very confusing spot of like, how do I get state from this component to that component, and just overly thinking those things. So generally, if the state has to be in one component, it should just be in that component. Like if that's the only component that uses the state, just use the useState hook, declare the state in that component. But if you have state that multiple components will use, it may not be a bad idea to use some more advanced techniques other than just having state and passing props and doing all this fun jazz. Okay, so what you can do is you can use something called context. So we're going to talk about context, and then we're going to talk about the useReducer hook. And then if time, some bonus stuff. Okay, so what happens is there is a hook, well, there is a thing in React called context. What it does, it creates, really what it's doing, it's creating two components, a provider and a consumer. The provider, what it does, it provides information, and then the consumer can then receive that information, okay, and then you can use it to get access to that data that was inside, that was provided by the provider. Okay, so I'll show you how we can create a instance of state that's our like application level state and make it available to our entire app, and then we can just literally just use it wherever we need it. So I'm going to leave it with all these routes because I'm going to want to take advantage of that. But essentially the way this would work, probably the simplest way to do this, is let's just create a separate file. We're going to call this our, not in there, not in the pages folder. Let's create in our source folder, new file. We're going to create our application state.js. Okay, and what we want to do is create a custom component that's going to provide. So first thing we want to do is import create context from React. What this function does, it creates a new context, which creates that consumer and provider for us. Okay, so we have that now. We'll just create the context. We'll say const, app context equals create context. Okay, we can just pass it null. It doesn't really matter what you pass it initially. Okay, so we'll do that. Great. Then we'll create a variable for our initial state, just so that we have some definition of what our state should look like. And generally, if you're going to have one app-wide state, it should just be an object that you can manipulate. So app, so const initial state equals, and we'll just put like some things in there. We'll just say like color red, so you might want to put like your color theme in here or something like that, so that way anywhere you use your color theme, if the color theme changes, it updates throughout your entire app or something like that. Again, this is just an example. Okay, so we'll just say the color red for now. Okay, or we'll just say like font red background, font red, well, let's just see this. Let's say background crimson and the font white. Okay, and we'll use that later on. Okay, so that's going to be our initial state. So now that we have that set up, we're going to create a custom component that we can then use to easily provide this to the rest of our app without us having to deal with a lot of these hooks and stuff all that often. So what we're going to do is we're going to say function function app state equals, or props, whatever. Okay, and what all this component's going to do is just wrap our app. Just literally, it's just kind of like that router component that wraps our app component when we did the router lesson. This is going to do the same thing. So what we do is we're just going to return basically a div that returns props.children. Okay, actually not even. I'll come back to that. It's going to be in there. Really what we want is the provider. So the app context.provider component, and then in there we'll put props.children. Okay, and again, that provider component is what provides data to the rest of our app. But what we want to do is create some state before we do that. So we'll just import the useState hook. Okay, we'll import the useState hook. And now from the useState hook, we will declare some state. So we'll just call this like, you know, app state, camel case. We'll just call this state and set state. Simple, let's keep it simple. State and set state equals use state, and then we pass it the initial state because that's going to be the initial state. And then what you do is you want to pass what the provider provides. So we'll say the value that the provider is providing to the rest of the app. It really only can provide one value, but again, you can share as many things inside of an object or an array as you like. So what you do is you pass an object to value, and in that object will pass state and set state. Cool. So now when I use this component, it'll provide state and set state to the rest of its children. So that's what this component's going to do. And then the last thing we need to make, and we're going to want to export this function because we want to export this component because we'll be using it. And then we just want to create a custom hook to make it easier to grab the context. Okay, so we're going to export, we'll say function use app state. Okay, and all this is going to do is we need to use this hook called useContext. useContext allows us to get the data that's provided by a particular context. All you have to do is use this context hook, and then you pass it the context. But what we can do is create a custom hook so we don't have to worry about importing the context and the hook all the time. So we just say return useContext app context. So that's going to make the useContext call for us wherever we use it. And there we're good. We're good. So this, now we have the tools we need to have an easy way to use Stato across our app. So now once you have this all created, I can then go to app, not app, I actually want to go to index.js, and I can wrap the app state. Well, first I got to import it. So let me import app state. App state from /application state. Okay, so I import my component, and then I just wrap all of this in app state. Just like I wrapped everything in router, because router is doing the same thing under the hood. Okay, cool. And then technically, like all those other components like routes and route, they're using the they're using that useContext hook to pull in the data into router, which allows us to use that, like that useParams hook and that useNavigate hook. All that's feeding off that router. That's this router component that's providing, in the same way that our app state component is now providing access to that state. So now any component I want, I can now like pull that state. So I can be like import. All I have to do import now is use app state from well, technically it's up a folder, / application state. And then what I would do is I would just say like const state set state equals use app state. And now I have that, I'm getting that function and that state that's been provided, and I should have access to the state. So watch, I can do state dot color. Well, actually, let me see. What did I call it? Let's go back to application. Say I called it font and background. So we'll say state dot background. Okay. Or actually, let's use it the way we meant to use it. So in this case, I would say hello world, except again, the idea is that the state should be setting the theme of our website. So I'm going to say style equals, and then here I'll say color equals state dot font, and then background color equals state dot background. Okay, and let's start the server and see if that works. So npm start. So then when I go to the home page, I should see some colors. So let's see here, it's loading. So let's see here, object is not iterable. Let me see here, where does it not like? React DOM, application state. Where am I looping over? Oh, because it's returning, I see why. Because it's returning an object. So I want to use object destructuring. So I really want to wrap this in curly brackets, actually. Boop. Okay, and there we go. And see, notice, it is having the effect we wanted. It's changing the background of home to crimson and changing the font color to white. Okay, and I can, again, do the same thing in now in another control, in another one, I could import that stuff. So let's do it in other. And I will, once again, import use app state from application state. We'll again then, you know, bring in the state. So const curly brackets state set state equals use app state. And this is technically the same thing that I just imported from the previous one. And now what I could do is that maybe after all this, I'll put a button. Okay, change theme. Okay. And in this function, when I click on it, on click equals, and I gotta pass it a function. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use set state. Again, I want to create a copy of the original state, so I'll say dot 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 state, because that's again an object with the dot 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 dot. That's going to make a copy. And then I'm going to say I really want color to be pink and background to be green. Okay, and that'll update the state. But again, that's the application state, so it's going to force the whole application to re-render. So now if I go to other, I click the change theme button, and now I go back to home, and the theme has changed. Okay, so that's one cool way of having the same state. So again, if you want to make sure like the to-do list is available across the whole app, or again, don't put everything in this kind of level of application, like application-wide state. The reason why you don't want to just put it everywhere is, or put everything in there, is because it's going to become huge, and then again, every time it changes, your entire app is re-rendering, which is inefficient. You should only really do that with the data that is going to really be used across many parts of your app. Okay, so always think like it's always better to house the state in the component, okay, or create like a component that is stateful and that passes the props to another, that passes the data down as props. That's always a better pattern. It's going to make your website faster. But again, of course, having too much state all over the place can also just make the app really hard to understand and hard to refactor. So you got to find that balance of sort of like, what do I want to store for the entire application versus what do I want to store in individual components, and kind of work from there. Okay, and then also think about how you want to distribute that state. Do I want to distribute it in sort of like a middle component that then passes it as props, or do I want to distribute that data directly to the component that creates my UI? And think about sort of what works best for your particular application. But yes, so that's what the useContext hook does. So if we go back to application state, what the useContext hook is doing is that it allows us to pull in the data that's being provided by that particular context, in this case app context. Again, I don't have to call it app context. I can call it whatever I want. But this will pull the data from that particular context. Now, I don't have to use useState. What if I wanted to have a pattern that's more like Redux? What Redux does is that instead of me having, like, notice how I had to write that function and like do the whole logic for updating the state in that function. What I could do is I could move that logic to here. So that way I don't have to put that logic in my individual components. What I would do is I would use useReducer. So instead of using the useState hook, I would use the useReducer hook. And this whole pattern is going to be a lot like Redux. So I can still use this app state pattern. The only difference is that now I need a reducer function. Okay, so first I'm going to write a reducer function, which is a function. Let me see if I remember correctly. It should be, I always have to look this up. The useReducer React. I always forget what the arguments that the callback takes. useReducer. There it is. It takes this old state first, and then something called the action. We'll talk about that in a second. So essentially, again, this will always take the state first, always takes whatever the state is currently, and then it takes a action, which is just, it could be anything. Okay. There is a sort of standard way of handling it though. So usually what you'll do is that the action is typically an object, and it's generally an object with two properties, type and payload. Okay, the type usually is like a string that lets you identify what are you trying to do. And then the payload is any, supporting information you may need to do that thing. Okay, so again, right now our context here is really kind of holding the data for our theme, like our color theme. So let's just say we have different color themes, and we're going to put that logic in this reducer. So I might say, like, if action.type is green or equals green, then what's going to happen is that you return an object that represents the new state. So in that case, what I want is to again, I'm making a copy of the old state, but then I want the font color to be white, string of white, and the background to be green. Okay, and then I would just make this if statement a few more times. You could also use a switch. You'll oftentimes see people use a switch, but just to keep things simple, I'll use ifs. Okay, and then basically, I'll do, a pink version. Okay, and then what happens here is I'll say, in that case, we want to change the font to crimson, and then the background color is pink. And then we'll have a situation where we have it to be blue, where the background will be blue and the font color white. And again, this returned object becomes the new state every time this reducer function runs. So you always want to have like a situation that happens no matter what. So worst comes to worst, it'll just return the original state. Okay. So what's going to happen is that, again, that actions type property will be matched, see if any of these if statements run, and that becomes the new state. Okay, so that's the reducer. I'm not using any payload here, but I could theoretically say like something equals action.payload to update the state. Again, that action could be whatever you want. It could just be a string or whatever, but the typical pattern is a object with the property of type and payload. That is typically what most people do because they're basing it off the patterns that they're used to in another library called Redux. Okay, cool. But again, you could create your own pattern. So that's state. Okay, wonderful. And that's all fine and good. And then what I would do here is that instead of using state, I would use the reducer. I would use the useReducer hook, and then I would pass the reducer hook, the reducer, and then the initial state. So I'm still getting state, but instead of getting set state, now I'm getting something called dispatch. It's a function to use the reducer. And so then in this case, I'd want to distribute dispatch throughout my app. Okay, so that's the change here. Right? That's how it would look like if I want to use the useReducer hook. Again, I could use the useState hook, and that works totally fine. But again, the benefit is I'm housing the logic here. I don't have to necessarily write all that logic all around my app. So like all the different possible state changes will be within these if statements. So now if I go back to other, I want dispatch. So I'm going to replace this with dispatch. And let me just do that at home so that doesn't get an error. So dispatch. Okay, and that's those complaining that set state's not defined. Where? Other page 20. Oh yeah, that's right. We're going to refactor this now. So instead of using set state to update the state, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use dispatch. Okay, and dispatch takes an action. So whatever I pass dispatch is the action. It's going to run and pass that to the reducer. So in this case, I just want to pass it an object with the type pink. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this button pink because I'm going to create one for each of the scenarios that we made. Okay, so once I have that whole reducer set up, this actually becomes a lot easier because now I can just go boop, boop, and then, well, this should be pink because I think I did a lowercase in my reducer. So let me just double check. Yep. So green, pink, blue. So I passed just sort of, again, the right type. So pink, blue, green. So blue, green. So notice again, I'm not saying what I want the new state to be. I'm passing this object with the property of type, and the new state gets determined based on these if statements. So whatever these if statements end up returning becomes the new state. Okay, that's how reducers work. So instead of you telling it what the new state is, you have this list of possible state changes, and using that type property of the action, you're determining which one of those happens. But the benefit is like you have a lot less code in here because I don't have to sit there and explain exactly what the state changes are going to be. I just pass the type. So let's go to the React app. Okay, now if I see right now we have our original theme, and if I go to other and I click on pink, I go to home. See, I got the pink. I click on blue, I got the blue theme. I click on, well, I broke blue twice, but if I click on this one, I should have the green theme. There it is, because what happens is when I click on the right button, it calls dispatch. I'm passing it the object with the type of pink. That object is being passed in as the action along with the old state. And then basically when I clicked on green, since action.type equaled green, it changed it to this object and it updated the state accordingly. So that's like the useReducer pattern. So again, that's all the reducer is. It's just instead of you telling it directly what the state change should be using set state, you're giving it some information, you're giving it an action, and based on the action, the reducer will determine what the state change is. That's the difference. Again, you can change what the action is. This function is up to you how it works. Okay, all you know is that whatever dispatch is passed to dispatch will be passed as that second argument. Okay, and then you plan for that. But again, typically what you'll see in the wild is people passing the type. Now, in the Merced React Hooks library, I do have some hooks to help you set this stuff up pretty easily. Okay, so we'll say, just to kind of show you, I will create a separate file, new file, more appstate.js. Okay, so if I were to kind of create the same initial pieces, so let me just copy the initial state in the reducer. I just want to keep those parts. I don't care about the rest. Oops, I don't want to cut them out. Just copy them. So if I just took those pieces and added them in here, and I want to use the Merced npm.js.com. Okay, and we're going to use Merced React Hooks. Okay, and then let's see, let me find the right hook for that. There's use data store. That's going to be more like the original. Well, actually, no, this is what I want. So let me just double check. Create data store. Oh, there it is. Okay, initial. Yep. So this is what I would want to use. So in this case, to do that same thing with the useReducer hook, but without having to set up all that boilerplate code, I could use Merced React hooks and just sit there and say import use. Well, actually, what I want to import is create data store from Merced React hooks. And then what I do is I then export the result of export const data store use data store equals create data store, and then I pass in the initial state, I pass in the reducer, and this is going to essentially do everything I did on that other file. This is going to give me, it's giving me the component, so I don't have to make the component, and it's giving me the hook, so I don't have to make the hook. So you get the same thing. All you have to do is define the initial state in the reducer, pass that to create data store, and that's going to give you again the provider component, which again you would then take to index.js and wrap around. So I would then import data store. Okay, let me just make sure that I imported it in right. So more, yeah, I wrote data store. Okay. So I would, where did I go? Index, that's where I want to go. So I would want to import data store from /more app state as an example. And then again, I would wrap that provider component, data store. And then I can use the hook to do the same thing. So instead of here, instead of using use app state, I would put use data store. So import use data store. Okay, and then instead again replace this with use data store, because again, instead of me having to set it all up, my function kind of did all the boilerplate for you. This will work the same way. Okay, and that's all set. And then I can go to home, and I would do the same thing. I would import use data store from /more app state. Let me just make sure I did that from, yep, for more app state, and then just replace this with use data store. I end up with the same, I'm going to end up in the same place. Okay, so if I go back to the app, default export, you see here index.js. So I got imported wrong there. Oops, yeah, I didn't write I need to write the curly brackets. Okay. Reading font. So let me go over here. Of undefined. Let me actually read my documentation. Probably has a different name. Oh yeah, it's not called state anymore. It's called data store. So we have to change the way it's destructured. So this has got to be data store, because that's the way it comes out as. And then here in other, I got to import data store. So everywhere I use state here, I got to change that to data store. Okay, and there we go. I'm in the same place. So I can click pink, turns pink, click blue. But again, I can now share that state across my app. I house all the logic of how the application changes inside that reducer function. But again, using Merced React hooks, I don't have to necessarily, worry about the boilerplate of setting up the provider component and creating the hook. That's just going to be done for me. So this is a tool you have to set this up quicker. Okay, and then there's a couple other really cool sort of, there's this one right here, task one, or this one I'm actually quite a big fan of. It works the same way, but instead of a reducer, you create a task list, which is just an object of functions. So in that case, what you do differently is that you'll get a run task function, and just like, like you would with dispatch, you're going to pass a string that represents which function in the object you want to run. Okay, it's a different pattern. I'm not going to get too deep into it. I do have a video on the task runner pattern. Just look up Alex Merced task runner, and I'll go over how that works. But there's several other sort of like, advanced state management hooks that I have in here. Like I have use local storage, so that way if you want to create like state that's automatically synced with local storage, you can do that. Okay, we have use global state. Okay, I think this one's going to be more like the first way we did it with useContext, where we use the use state. Okay, then there's this use global map key. This was meant to be more like recoil. It's close, not quite there, but the idea is that this creates sort of like a global state that caches things. So basically what it'll do is that you can create an individual piece of state within a particular component, so it feels like you're just creating state in that component, but you're really making it app wide, very much like recoil. I built it here just in case like people don't want to install another library. They have this option. Okay, we already mentioned the use form state. We mentioned the use local storage. There's this, so you can set up a default images for images. What it does, it creates a component that has a default image. So that way, if you don't know how to set up a default image, this takes care of that. So if an image is broken, it will automatically show the default image. Use fetch, we mentioned that. Use CRUD, that's for like CRUD APIs. It's a thing. These are just other ones that make it easier to use particular structs, different types of structures as state. So if you want to use like a map or an object as your state, this gives you a fun way of doing it. Use array creates a way of using state that feels more like just using array. So it actually has methods like push, pop, all that, but it'll automatically update the state instead of just pushing into the array, making it easier to use a array as state. Then there's create transform, which allows you to create components that transform what they wrap around. So there's a lot of cool stuff here in Merced React hooks if you want to go in there and dig around. But that ends this React 2021 course. There's a lot of things to learn in React, but hopefully, again, this video was advanced state management. So again, this video probably seemed a little intense. You might want to try out these things after you get comfortable with everything else from the previous videos. Best way to start is make to-do lists. Make a bunch of to-do lists. Because it's a good app that really kind of forces you to kind of get acquainted with a lot of things, forms, state. Then try to break up the to-do list into multiple components, so that way you can practice props. So maybe, you have the form in one component, but you have where you display the to-dos in another component. Then try doing a to-do list where you manage the state for the to-dos using one of these patterns that we talked about in this video. A to-do list is a great simple project that allows you to focus on learning the thing without getting too bogged down in the other details that might distract you from what you're trying to learn. I recommend that for any back-end or front-end framework or technology as you learn it, the best thing to build is a to-do list. I've built so many to-do lists and they've been super useful for learning. So that's my advice as you practice, React and getting better at React. But have a great day. I'll see y'all later.